Thank you, Nora, and thank you all for being here today as we prepare to wonk out some more. My name is John Michael Cortez. As Nora mentioned, I have the honor and the privilege of serving on the board of directors of HousingWorks Austin and chair of the Advocacy Committee. And every once in a while, Nora and Yves give me some time off so that I can work at G-Fiber, and real excited to be here today. We have an amazing panel that has assembled here to talk about a very timely topic here in Austin, addressing the jobs and housing mismatch and expanding equitable transit-oriented development. So I think in Austin, we've, for at least the last several years, have really recognized and taken action on connecting housing and job opportunities, because in an urban region, it is critical to ensure that our community has equitable and sustainable growth. Increasingly and very appropriately, affordability is seen both through the housing lens and the mobility lens. And this is the old drive till you qualify. Although workers may find relatively affordable housing at a greater distance from their workplace, the increased transportation costs impact the household finances negatively. In addition, this has a very detrimental impact on employee retention, quality of life, and the ability of households to build assets. At the same time, the mismatch between jobs and housing can influence transit ridership and the long-term success of any major mobility investments, which of course we're finally starting to do here. I think it's fair to say that Austin actually has a pretty long track record of aligning our housing and land use and our transportation policies. Some of y'all remember back in the, the early 2000s, our first vertical mixed use ordinance that applied on core transit corridors, even though some of those core transit corridors didn't actually have any transit on them. We also had our early TOD overlays around the red line stations and the subsequent station area plans. Mueller is a large example of trying to align our investments in development and housing and transportation. And then of course, as Mayor Watson mentioned, the council is about to undertake a lot of changes to our land development code and a new ETOD ordinance, Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Ordinance and overlay. So this panel again is very timely. We're going to focus on solutions such as equitable TOD, expanding attainable housing opportunities through zoning reform, and the development of affordable housing in proximity to transit stations, and meaningfully addressing potential displacement impacts. So I'm going to introduce the panel real quick. They have amazing bios, which are on the app and on the website, so I encourage you to look at that. But first, we have Chessy Brady, who is the Transit-Oriented Development Manager at the Regional Transportation District of Denver, RTD. And Chessy's already had a great introduction into Austin culture. I understand she ran around the Butler Trail around the lake. Was it this morning or last night? Last night, where she ran into some topless sunbathers at Barton Springs who complimented her on her running attire. So welcome to Austin. That's that keep it weird thing. We also have Chapple from UC Berkeley and UT. I got really excited when I saw UT, but then it's University of Toronto. But that's cool too. She's the professor emerita and director of the School of Cities and a professor of geography and planning. So she'll tell us what we're doing right and wrong. Then we have Annie Fryman from the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association, commonly known as SPUR, where she is Director of Special Projects. And last but not least, we have Christian Díaz, who is the Director of Equitable Community Development, and he's with Palenque LSNA, which I learned stood for Logan Square Neighborhood Association, but they've rebranded now to Liberating Spaces for Neighborhood Action, which I thought was really cool, that you have a neighborhood association that's kind of changed the meaning of its acronym. I wish we could do that here for something. We have one, the West Austin Neighborhood Group, which has got a weird acronym, and it'd be interesting. But in any case, we're welcome here, and Christian is also with Elevated Chicago. And I think he was telling me that a lot of his friends and colleagues, when they heard he was coming to Austin, they were jealous, as they should be. and that he has to try breakfast tacos. So he hasn't tried any yet, and so he's asking where to go. So when you see Christian after the panel, let him know where the best breakfast tacos are and why it's Joe's Bakery. So we've got a lot to talk about, so let's just jump right into it. I'm going to start with just a brief question for all of you and ask you to tell us a bit about your work and that of your organization in housing, community development, and transit-oriented development. So let's start with you, Chessy.
Sure. So as we said, I'm the Transit-Oriented Development Manager at RTD. So I work for the transit agency. So my focus is transit, but I'm kind of the most housing-ish person at RTD. And I like to attend conferences like this in Denver and be the only transit person there. So my work at RTD is divided into two capacities. One is encouraging high-density development on private land around our stations, which means advocating for higher density, lower parking ratios, good connections to the platforms. And then the other part of my job is focused on the land that RTD actually owns, which at transit stations, which at this point is really park and rides. So I spend a lot of time talking about parking, both parking for transit and parking for residential and commercial uses, and how we have too much of all of it. And I'm currently really focused on reducing our parking supply at transit stations in order to convert it into affordable housing. So taking our underutilized park and rides and removing parking, which is a big deal, very scary for a lot of people at RTD, and instead filling those empty spaces with affordable housing where people who need the transit can live there, and that can also generate ridership for RTD, because as the transit agency, and in my own internal advocacy, what I really have to pay attention to is what everyone else around me at my job wants, which is ridership and revenue. And so I'm going to be approaching a lot of the questions today from that perspective of like what's best for the transit agency and how I convince everyone around me to focus on housing.
Great, thank you. Annie Fryman with SPUR from San Francisco. I'll give, I guess, a short two-part answer to my work and background, and then also the organization I work for. I spent 5 or 6 years working in local government in San Francisco, and then up in the California state capitol, working on statewide housing, land use, and transportation policy. And I think that's relevant to a lot of the discussion we're working on today, because so much of what the direction that California has taken has been about this balance and tension between when is state preemption of local housing and land use and infrastructure good policy, and when is doing a lot of this work and implementation at the local level good policy? What gets us closer to good outcomes? And so we've seen in California, and I was in the state capitol, leading and participating in a lot of this work for 4 years or so. How are we staying principled and focused on outcomes when it comes to addressing our state housing affordability crisis, our housing shortage, our mismatch of planning values when it comes to where's the transportation and where are the people living? And when are the politics not lined up to do that locally? Because a lot of passing policy is actually how do we get that outcome, and some of that requires actually going to the state capitol. So that was a huge chunk of my career, and now we're in an interesting point where I'm now at SPUR, which is a research center and public policy think tank that also does advocacy and education, a lot of the same language HousingWorks I actually see coming out of this organization. I'm now focused on the local implementation in San Francisco of so many of those state laws that were passed and are actively getting moved through the legislature. So this balance of when policy happens at the state level that impacts housing, that impacts land use, that impacts transportation decisions, usually it's still the local level that's implementing it, regardless of where the policy was adopted. And so I'm kind of on the other side of that right now, working on that execution, that implementation, and that last step to policy that was kind of developed in this abstract. It was finished by the legislature, it's now real, and now we've got to make sure that it really materializes in real homes, in affordable homes, and located in the right places.
Great. Thank you all for having me back to Austin. It's always so great to feel the culture and the warmth. Y'all are great. And congratulations on your planned and expanding transit system. So So I'm here with the group because what I have worked on for the last 15 years or so is the relationship between transit, transit investment, new transit investment, displacement, and gentrification. And most of my work has been for the state of California, and then also the regional governments, ABAG and SCAG in California. And I wrote a book called Transit-Oriented Displacement or Community Dividends, which you can get for free on MIT Press. But the book really points out that it's complicated and context matters a lot. And you can't just say, ooh, boom, new transit station, oh, there's gonna be gentrification, and then everybody's gonna get displaced. It's just not like that. It's not a linear relationship like that. And what we point out, first of all, is that when that transit system is planned, a lot of that displacement is taking place already, decades before it gets built, right? So the time frames are super long, and you need to be very strategic for that region. And even then, even though that displacement is taking place and speculation is taking place, not every station is going to flip. That's what the local context matters. So we can find, park and rides where you don't have displacement, or places that are super pedestrian unfriendly. They're not going to displace. So you have to really think about it station by station. So that's why I'm a professor of urban planning, because I believe in neighborhoods and thinking about local context. Secondly, our most recent work on displacement has been looking at new housing supply and what that does in terms of opening up the neighborhood to new people and also pushing people out. And what's that relationship? And so I have an article this week in the Journal of the American Planning Association on that. And the punchline is that building new housing supply just moves the needle a tiny bit. It tends to open up the neighborhood a little bit. It tends to decrease rents a little bit. And it tends to displace a tiny proportion of the households. And so if you really want to make a difference in your neighborhood, if you really want to stabilize the neighborhood, don't look towards building your way out of it. Make sure you preserve housing and protect the tenants. So.
Chris?
Great. So my name is Christian, and my mother brought me to this country when I was a baby from Mexico in search of a better life. She moved here as a single mom, and eventually we made our home in Chicago on the Northwest Side in a neighborhood called Logan Square, which I describe as the displacement capital of the Midwest. We are suffering in Logan Square. Since the year 2000, 20,000 Latinx folks have been displaced from our community, and it's tragic, it's horrible. And if you zoom out and look at all of Chicago, since 2000, 400,000 black residents have been displaced from the city. And the reason people of color are being harmed is because of gentrification, this overinvestment in only Latino communities, and then the structural disinvestment in black communities because we don't value those neighborhoods. But growing up in Logan Square, my mom was able to purchase a 3-flat, so a multifamily home, and we are 5 minutes away from the Logan Square Blue Line station. And what that meant for us is that, if you're not familiar with Chicago, the Blue Line connects our airport to our downtown. And so living along that Blue Line station meant that we had access to jobs and opportunity in the biggest economic hubs of the city. And it also meant that in high school, I could take the train downtown and get an internship at the Field Museum. And so I recognize the value of living near transit, and I also recognize what's happening in our community, which is this push for more density near transit, and in the name of environmentalism, right? Environmental justice. We want people to rely less on cars. Well, here's the irony for my community. Because people of color are being displaced and we can't afford to stay in Chicago, we end up moving to suburbs that are transit deserts. And so we're actually increasing the reliance of cars for people of color and vulnerable people. Now, what are we doing about it? We have 2 strategies. Growing up in a multifamily home near transit made home ownership accessible to my family because we could rent the other 2 units, right? So we have that gentle density that we benefit from. And so our goal is to preserve that multifamily generational housing, because so much of that housing stock is being converted to single family homes. And so we're actually lowering density through gentrification. The flip side of that is that we're building these tall, dense luxury towers in our community as well, which are mostly studios that rent for $2,000 to $4,000 a month. So not only do our families on average not fit in those units, in those homes, we can't afford them anyway. And so my proudest achievement in my career is that we had a city-owned parking lot, massive parking lot, right in the center of Logan Square. Today, that parking lot is 100 units of affordable housing. And it's across the street from the Logan Square Blue Line station, which I love. So yes, preservation and more equitable transit-oriented development. That's what I'm about.
As you can see, a lot of great work from a lot of different angles represented on this panel. So, as was mentioned by Mayor Watson, and I think Karen also mentioned it, and I hope everybody knows, we are embarking on Project Connect and investing in a transit system here in Austin. It's taken us a while, my favorite thing to say about Austin, is adapted from Churchill, is you can always count on Austin to do the right thing after we've exhausted every other alternative. And so we're finally getting around to embarking on the development of a more comprehensive transit system. So I think we all assume that it's important to expand housing, employment, and other opportunities near our transit investments, but let's talk about why. Why is that important? Let's underscore why we're embarking upon this. Let's go ahead and start with you.
Sure. So from a transit perspective, transit and housing or activity have a symbiotic relationship. You can't have good transit in running through the plains, as we would in Denver, and you can't have good housing if it's not connected, if it's all out in the suburbs and nobody can get anywhere. So from my perspective, doing that, increasing development conscientiously, equitably, with a very firm emphasis on affordability is essential to supporting the transit system, just as the transit system will support the residents or the office workers or the retail workers, what have you, around the station. And the other side of that is really the transit death spiral, which some transit agencies find themselves in, where you have, if the ridership starts to disappear, then the service cuts start, and then it becomes less comfortable on the service, and the ridership keeps decreasing until nothing is working anymore, and there's no money and there's no clout from the transit agency to advocate for more. So the more that land use can support transit, the more this, not the opposite of a vicious cycle. Good cycle. A virtuous, thank you. A virtuous cycle can support, back and forth in a really beneficial way. And I do think the key to that is the affordable housing. We know in Denver that what has happened over in the last 20 years since we passed our fast tracks measure in 2004, which was a massive expansion for us, is that market rate developments that went in along our rail stations, we see people flock to them. They're very happy to be living there. They love the idea of living near transit, but especially post-COVID, they aren't taking it. The white-collar workers are not going to the office as much, and they were driving even before. So now they take it to the sports arena every once in a while, or the Taylor Swift concert when she was in town. But what we also really learned in a very concrete way during COVID was that low-income people continue to use the system. And so it's both, again, beneficial for low-income families to live near transit, where they have better access to jobs and schools and healthcare. And for the transit agency to continue to operate, we have to have those riders. And so we need that density, and we need those good connections to keep running our system and to keep building our system.
Great. I sort of want to echo and also build on a lot of what Chessy said. I think that one of the main things that came to mind when I sort of heard this question, thought about this myself, is that so much of when we are developing and planning our transit lines, right, those are massive pieces of infrastructure. In some cases, they take years or decades to actually come to full completion from planning. And in many ways, they're a statement of where are infrastructure decisions going that are going to be creating this North Star for places and nodes broadly, right? And so then the next question is, what is the placemaking strategy we have there, right? Like, which communities are actually being served by what is at these transit stations? Not every single trip that every single resident takes is going to be able to be serviced on that one specific line in a reasonable way. How do we make sure that the alternative is walking to that thing rather than getting in your car and doing that thing, right? And so are we also having grocery stores near our transit? Are we also having our hardware stores and our pharmacies and all of these other types of employment centers that are not just big office buildings and white collar jobs, but are actually both practical for people outside of their workday as well as job centers? And I think that looking at how we're planning, especially rail transit, and then what is the surrounding area, who is that serving, and also critical to that and central to that, who are the people that are being served and are able to access the housing that is also there? Because I think that it's not just enough to say, oh, around this transit station, we're going to have housing because we're going to assume that everyone will able to do every single thing they need in their life through that one line, right? Maybe that isn't a line that actually connects you to your life. And so how do we keep that radius of what people can do close to their home also a place that serves them and isn't an island when it comes to all of the other things they need that's not just a train and it's not just where they sleep at night?
Yeah.
So you're putting in a new transit system. Land values are going to rise around every station on that system because you've provided more accessibility. So there's a premium and there's a windfall. So, by the way, I loved your mayor this morning. He's a hoot. And Mayor Watson made this point about intergenerational equity and who's going to be able to be there. So I guarantee that the folks getting that windfall around transit are not young. I bet they're not under 40. Right? They're the older landowners of Austin. And to go back to Dr. Perry's point, this is wealth begetting wealth. These are inequities that are baked in to land ownership in Austin that are just going to be exacerbated by this transit system. So that's the big picture context you're dealing with here. So then your question was, what's important? Why is it important to focus on jobs and housing and density and complete communities around transit? So it's important so that, first of all, people can stay in the neighborhood as those values go up, and because those are going to be the riders, as Annie pointed out. Secondly, we need to have the jobs near transit. Also for those low-income workers, and also because we know from all of our studies that access to destinations is the best way to generate ridership for a transit system. So make sure we get lots of jobs in there as well. And then thirdly, thinking about the downtown of downtown Austin and how it has suffered. It's about 73% of its pre-pandemic levels in terms of activity. So you need that core for the region. You need downtown Austin, and that's why these transit stations are going to be super important.
Chris. Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations on winning that new rail system. It's fantastic. And I think most of us believe in this room that all people, regardless of race, income, religion, really any form of identity, all people deserve the opportunity to succeed in school and in life. And that means having access to stable housing. It means having access to public transit, right? It means having access to equitably funded education. And so what I want to highlight for Austin as this new amenity comes into the city is that, I've kind of lived through this in Logan Square through the creation of an elevated park in our community, a brand new amenity that's meant to make our community more walkable, more healthy. And what happened overnight? Property values shot up by 240%. And we started seeing massive rates of demolitions and displacement. And so what happens when you bring a new amenity like this light rail system is that people are going to compete to live nearby it, right? And we're pitting communities that have historically been prohibited from building wealth, from building other forms of cultural capital, having now to compete with people from the suburbs who have tons of generational wealth. And I also want to make this point about wealth. I love Dr. Perry's presentation, the slide with the wealth increase. You know, we notice how extreme the wealth increase in white communities is, right? And I have to question, is that something we aspire to? Because that extreme wealth wouldn't be possible without the genocide of indigenous people on this land. It wouldn't be possible without the enslavement of Africans who were stolen from their continent and brought here against their will to be exploited. And so, no, I don't want to address the racial wealth gap because it would mean participating and amplifying those systems of oppression. So what we did with our elevated trail, and we really should have done it before it even opened, right, before the ribbon cutting, is that we created a policy where if developers are going to tear down multifamily housing that's been historically affordable, they have to pay a premium, and then that money goes to fund a community land trust so that our communities can own land. What this means in practice is that we recently sold our third home near the elevated trail. We sold it for $270,000 to a teacher, right, and her family who had previously been displaced from our community. Next door to her, a home was deconverted from a 3-flat to a single-family home. It sold for $1.4 million, right? So just look at the difference in price, right? And the accessibility of it. And so my challenge for Austin, my wish, is to get really creative about policies around the light rail system so that you can mitigate some of these harmful impacts that become possible.
Thank you, Christian. And let's stay on that because, you know, it's incredibly important. You know, well, one, as Annie mentioned, and I think this is important for us all who are involved in policy and policy making is, you know, we won our referendum in 2020, or we adopt an ordinance change at council. We all, you know, pat ourselves on the back, you know, drink some beer and say, hey, we did it, right? Implementation is the hard part, right? You know, building the political will to actually get that decision made and that change made, as hard as it really is the easy part. Implementation is the hard part, right? And so, you know, as we begin to implement our transit system, you know, we've all touched on it, you know, we are concerned about the impacts on the people who are already near where those investments are going to be. And when we make policy, at least in my opinion, you know, the rule ought to be first, do no harm, right? And so as we finally get around to heavily invest in transit, Austin, as Karen mentioned, we've already experienced a lot of involuntary displacement of vulnerable communities before we even start those investments. There's rightfully a lot of concern that our transit investments may add fuel to the displacement fire. So Karen, I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit more about transit displacement and just what you're seeing, and then also what strategies different communities have employed in successfully addressing it. You know, what lessons should Austin learn from other places?
Yeah, so in our recent studies and also the work of Elizabeth Dalmel, who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania, studies generally show that there's actually not a ton of displacement when the transit comes in. And again, that's because the displacement may have happened decades before. But so what I actually take though from these studies is that this is a mitigable phenomenon. We ought to be baking into every transit investment layers of anti-displacement policies. And then we don't even have to sit here today. We can take the day off, right? We'll be good to go. And I mean, not that we're going to remedy the systemic issues that you brought up, but still, you know, we can do something about this. So actually, if you want to show my slides, I did bring a couple of my strategy slides here to give you some ideas about what we could actually do that could actually really help stabilize communities.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so interestingly, I had a couple slides from my last trip to Austin, And the city of Austin invited me here, and displacement was one of the things that we were talking about a lot at the time. Are we going to put the slides up, or?
Not yet.
We might need
yet.
the little remote thing.
Okay.
I don't know where that is.
But the reason I'm mentioning this is because the city of Austin edited my slides and crossed out everything that's not possible in Austin because of the laws in Texas. Yeah, so if you keep clicking through, here's my list of anti-displacement policies. This is our typology that we use, and cities around the country have adopted it, particularly in relation to transit systems. So you'll see this in Minneapolis, you'll see this in Charlotte, you'll see it in Los Angeles, you'll see it, keep clicking through, you'll see it in all over California. You'll see it in the state of California's policies. So there's a set of remedies which are building by building, tenant by tenant, tenant protection type remedies. That's the first column, keep clicking. The second column is a number of city policies that can be enacted or at the state level, but around preservation, around affordable production. And then the last set are the kind of long-term 30-year horizon solutions which need planning tools to put in place. So you'll see that a bunch of these are grayed out. That's what the city of Austin said, nope, can't do it here. Yeah. Forget about it. So is that wonderful? Is the people that hosted me here today from the city of Austin?
Oh, yeah. And to be clear, these aren't things that the city of Austin can't do because the city of Austin doesn't want to do them. Right. It's because the state legislature has preempted our ability to do these things.
And the sad thing is that we know from our research that a lot of these things work. So just cause evictions protections, I mean, that's like number one. It really, really does help stabilize communities, make sure that people are not unfairly evicted. Condo conversion restrictions, that is a fabulous tool to prevent people from taking older apartment buildings and condoizing them for higher income residents, basically flipping them. Impact and linkage fees, another great tool that cities have used, particularly on the coast. Can you go to the next slide? So the next slide is a strategy framework that we particularly use when talking about transit systems. And so the city, the folks at the city really went to town on this one. They did all this for me. Actually, so everything in green is good to go in Austin, which is great news. But forget about everything in that lower left-hand corner. So in a lot of places, you can leverage the market to do the work, to make sure that TOD is equitable and inclusive. Here, you can't really do that. You're not really allowed to leverage the market. So that whole bucket of tools, inclusionary zoning, et cetera, are off the table. What you can do is spend public money here. Well, that's great, but you know that can get really expensive. But so there's some fabulous tools here as well. And I will just point out a couple of them that I think Austin really ought to be thinking about in terms of its transit system. Certainly reduced parking requirements. Get rid of the parking requirements. Just get rid of them.
We did.
Okay, good. Okay, done.
Austin.
Because you know what's happening, and we saw this all over California, is that you would build the transit system, and then the rich people would move in because they want a place where they can drive and take transit and bicycle and walk. Right? They want to have choice. They want transportation choice. It's a really big thing for middle and income professionals. But taking those parking requirements away takes away that transportation choice and actually reduces the cost of housing too. So great, you're done with that. Joint development, which is how Los Angeles built a lot of affordable housing around its transit stations, is really, really important, and often that's leveraging the publicly owned land that the city has, or whatever you have around transit. And so actually having a joint development authority is really important in terms of getting things done. And so we found in our work that Los Angeles had less displacement and gentrification than San Francisco. For that reason, the Bay Area never quite got it together in terms of joint development. Land trusts, we've already heard about. I would also talk about density bonuses a little bit. I think that density bonuses are starting to be used in a very creative way. I'm working on a study right now with UT professor Jake Wegman, my former student, and Jake and I are looking at the ADU density bonus in San Diego, which is resulting in the construction of what they call granny towers. Instead of granny flats, granny towers. So basically, you have folks building 6 units in the backyard, or 8 units or 20 units under the ADU law. And they're doing it, and the density bonus is that you have to, you get the bonus if you build an affordable unit along with your market rate unit. So it's a great way to leverage more affordable housing out of your ADU law. I'm going to stop there.
Well, yeah, so there's things we can do, there's things we've done, but this is something, as far as transit-oriented placement, that we should be able to do something about. It's just unfortunate here in Austin, we kind of have one hand tied behind our back by the legislature, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do everything we can, continuing. So, a shout out to HousingWorks. We put out this fantastic scorecard every year to kind of hold all of ourselves and our community accountable to our affordable housing goals. And we have actually done a pretty good job as a community at getting lots of income restricted housing built, and have a lot in the pipeline as well. But when you look at the map of where it is, it's not terribly equitably dispersed. So I say that because in addition to wanting to ensure that we do no harm and that vulnerable communities can remain in place after we have invested in transit, we're also desperate and way behind in providing more equitable opportunities to live and work near transit in higher opportunity areas. So Annie, for you, the Bay Area, and we're very jealous of the transit system that y'all already have in all of your communities, but the Bay Area has long had transit, good transit, serving all sorts of different types of communities. Vulnerable communities and also communities that might be considered, pretty exclusive. How have you seen zoning and land use reform be used to facilitate more equitable and successful TOD opportunities, specifically in areas that historically have been exclusive? How do we make it happen there?
It's really hard and it's really essential. So I think that to answer this question, it's also important to step back and just acknowledge out front, building any kind of housing near rich people who have been opportunity hoarding for decades is exceptionally politically challenging. It is only more so when you're wanting to build affordable housing. I think so many of us have dealt with class and race-based NIMBYism in our own lives and our own work that looks like a million different things. And really what stares it straight in the face is saying, I'm gonna build a bunch of low-income housing in your historically very segregated community that has been opportunity hoarding for decades and decades and decades. And there's this perception that it is a threat to power, it is a perception to property values, it is a perception to all of these things. And so, as we've tried to tackle this, and so much of my work in California has been trying to really solve and address this very thorny problem, which is the flip side of TOD that runs the risk of displacing vulnerable communities that are already there, is we also need to be building housing in the rich places that can't gentrify. They're already gentrified. They've been gentrified for a lot of the time since their earliest history. And so how do you go about doing that? We have found in a lot of parts of California that unless you have an exceptionally progressive local government, and even in those cases, it's still challenging, you've got to go to the state level. And I understand that in Texas, that's probably a very different political calculus. But honestly, the further away you get from a few angry voters being able to toss someone out of office, the clearer a political path you're going to have. So I think that that's one piece of the framing about just the relationship between city government and state government. And I guess in between, there's also a regional government that is structured in different ways that could play a role there. I think that specific to policies, some of the things that we've seen in California, both in terms of building deeply affordable and subsidized low-income housing, as well as just more modestly priced and lower priced market housing, because it is not flashy or not luxury or not catering to that top of the market. One really powerful tool that we have actually adopted at the state level is that the entity that, or the agency that allocates tax credits for building affordable housing actually now has a layer on top of it that says, if you're proposing a project in a high opportunity area as scored by a mechanism that I think Karen contributed to some of the research on that we worked on at one point several years ago, you actually get bonus points on your application. And so building affordable housing in places that have really good air quality, really good public schools, really good amenities, and also are places that so many folks have been structurally excluded from being a part of for so many decades. We now say, we know it's more expensive to build there, but you're gonna get a bump in your scoring because it's really important to also have affordable housing in wealthy communities, because we do have an economy that depends on people of all income levels. Our climate goals require us to make it, in our climate goals, I speak as California here, I'm not sure if Texas has the same climate goals. Make it so that people can really be embedded in the communities that they're a part of and the part of the job market they're a part of and all of these different things. Another piece that we have seen in terms of building energy, I guess, and a pathway for affordable housing and lower cost housing in wealthier communities. Looking at the mechanism through which historic districts have been used in the past to actually be a tool for sort of freezing an area in amber and saying under the veil of aesthetics or under the veil of historic preservation, oftentimes that is a code for this is a rich place that doesn't want change. And change is a scary word to a lot of those folks because they have it pretty good right now. And so also taking a really critical eye to like, what are the goals of historic preservation? What are the outcomes of a lot of these historic preservation policies that we've had? And is it actually in alignment with them to say no new people can come here? Are we historically preserving the community that has been allowed to live here in the past? Or is it actually about architecture and buildings? I think that that's an important component as well. And then the last thing that I'll say is that we too in the Bay Area have been able to pass some state laws that actually work with our transit agency, the BART system in the Bay Area, which is our regional sort of line that connects the suburbs into Oakland and San Francisco and a lot of the major job centers. We too have passed state laws that say, hey, BART can actually be a sovereign local government and sovereign land use authority when it comes to building affordable housing on their parking lots. And so they actually don't have to go through the city council, they don't have to go through so many of those paths, and instead can really empower people like Chessy and our agencies to get that housing built. I think I had one more thing that I wanted to mention here. Oh, the last thing I was going to say is that the broader Bay Area and what we see, I think Los Angeles is similar in this way. We do have really, really, really exceptional transit service in our core, but there is meager access in so many of our more outer areas. However, in San Francisco, in Oakland, I think increasingly in San Jose and parts of the South Bay for us, transit is not just rail. Transit is also the bus system. And I think that we often forget about that because it's less of a visible piece of infrastructure. But when we look at, for example, a city like San Francisco that is extraordinarily wealthy, has seen extraordinary amount of displacement over the last many decades, we also have 97% of the city covered as extremely high quality transit access because of our bus system and that coverage. And so I think also it's really important when we look at the impacts of connecting communities through transit to also not just look at rail, but if you have a bus service or bus frequency or bus reliability that can be competitive with rail transit, it's really important to have that as a part of that conversation because we have historically not built rail connecting all communities. And in many cases, we can't, or it's not necessarily I don't want to say right thing to do, but it's just as good for transit access if we also include the bus there. So that's, I think, I'll leave it there.
You're here. So Chessy, Austin is investing heavily in acquiring land near our future transit investments, including what Mayor Watson mentioned earlier, 107 acres off of East Riverside near one of our future stations. So how is RTD utilizing publicly owned land in the Denver region to expand affordable housing opportunities? And what kind of partnerships and funding is making that possible? And what are things that we should apply here from your learnings?
First of all, I think it's so exciting that Austin is making that investment now, because that makes all the difference. Because really you only have one shot, or one shot every 30, 50, 90 years to do that development. And so if the city can actually control what's happening on that land, it gives you far more flexibility in what you want to put there to do the right planning, whether you want affordable here, you want office here, and you can really tailor the development around the station to fit the community surrounding the station, whether, if it's renter occupied or owner occupied, if it's gentrified, if it's wealthier, and you can, pick and choose to a much greater extent what happens on that land than just zoning would do. At RTD, as the transit agency, we were only able to acquire the land that we actually needed to implement our rail system. And so that means that what we're left with now is really just park and rides. And I mean, luckily, not luckily, ridership is so down post-COVID that parking utilization is way down as well. And so it's been exciting for me as the TOD manager to be able to take a new look at these properties over the past couple of years and convince the powers that be in RTD that maybe we don't really need all of these parking spots. And as long as the jurisdiction agrees, then we are starting to move forward on reducing our, say, a 1,500 space park and ride down, removing 650 spaces, and potentially putting in 800 to 1,000 100% affordable units, which is, I mean, if that really happens, then I feel like I can retire. But I'm like, that's what we're working on right now, and that's really exciting to see that mindset change in the transit agency that can accept that 650 empty spaces are worth far less than 800 units, which will house 1,000 plus people who will actually ride the train, and in this case, and the bus as well. And I think that's a really important point, that it's great that you have the light rail coming in. It's very exciting, but also don't forget your buses, because they are more nimble, of course, and they are far less expensive, and they are certainly where the bulk of our people ride, and the ridership that has come back post-COVID has come back on the bus. Our rail ridership is still way down, and so as a result, we're able to offer much better service, swap service to the bus where people really need it. And I think that's also an interesting, you were saying something about this that sparked a thought for me, which is that when it comes to gentrification and kind of developer interest and land values as rail stations go in, the market rate developers aren't really interested in development along bus lines, even BRT. I mean, I think that may be changing. I think there's a conversation about BRT and its effectiveness that is evolving. People are seeing it. But developers that I've talked to do not have confidence to build at BRT stations. And so that really is an opportunity for affordable housing, because those land values are not going to jump up the way that rail land will. And so affordable developers can take advantage of that land to build where people already are, say if it's a parking lot especially. And I think it's easy for me to promote development when I'm doing it on parking lots, right? If we were destroying neighborhoods, it'd be a very different conversation. And I think Denver is also unique. And again, for better or worse, we built our rail lines a lot of them along highways. So the displacement had happened when the highways went in. And we weren't displacing too much as we did that. But the counter to that is that our ridership is very low, because our train stations are hard to get to. They're right next to a highway. You only have half of the land to actually access them, and they aren't in originally densely populated areas. So there's so many trade-offs to this, and it's so important to look at them all together. I think so. When it comes to partnerships and getting things done, I think affordable housing everywhere is going to be hard. And for us, the only way we're getting it done is by involving every piece of the puzzle and then finding more pieces. So recently we approved a land discount, which is, again, a sea change for our agency, which is all about revenue and ridership. But we are going to be discounting land to support an affordable condo project. The city's also putting in money there. They're also waiving fees for infrastructure upgrades. For us, it's important the state is putting in money. They're providing grants that are going to help support that development. The Urban Renewal Authority is also contributing. Foundations are contributing, and the developers still looking for money. It just takes so many pieces and so much collaboration and coordination to make these projects happen. And I see so many of them fall apart, as I'm sure many of you do. Last thing I say is that I was staring at the grid, Karen's grid there, and so many of those things, there are 4 or 5 things that Austin can't do. But there's so many that you can, and I think so many of the other things are actually what we're finding to be effective in Denver. We only got inclusionary zoning in Denver a year or 2 ago, and it's not really operating yet. We don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but the density bonuses have been really important in Denver, and we have some legislation in the state right now that would upzone around all of our transit stations, coming from the state, and there's a big concern there that will limit the effectiveness of the density bonuses. So kind of chicken and egg thing there, but I mean that can be very effective. Any kind of TOD fund can be very effective, and then the parking, which if you've already done that, that's amazing. So I think I'll leave it there.
That's great. That's great. And so Christian, I think I know I'd like to hear a lot more about Elevated Chicago and what y'all are doing to achieve equitable transit-oriented development there and the work that's happening in Logan Square. But really the question is, as we move forward with our ETOD efforts here in Austin, how do we ensure the E, equity, remains at the center of that work?
I think we have to have surgical precision as we develop policies. And one example I can think of is we do have inclusionary zoning in Chicago. We require 20% of developments that are more than 10 units to be affordable. However, the rents are capped at 60% of the area median income in a gentrifying neighborhood where we have an influx of very wealthy folks, right? And so that overinflates the AMI. And meanwhile, people of color live at 30 to 50% of the area median income. So our inclusionary zoning policy isn't actually inclusionary towards people of color, which is ridiculous, right? And we're working on that.
We have a similar challenge here. Just our AMI has just skyrocketed phenomenally. So 80% MFI in a lot of Austin's, that's like market rate at this point.
Exactly. So when affordable units are capped at 60% of the area median income, what that means is $1,800 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment, which is just not accessible. And that's the other thing. We're not seeing 3-bedroom apartments being built near transit. We're seeing mostly studios and 1-bedrooms. And so that's the other issue, right? Because that's also exclusive to larger families. But really the story of Elevated Chicago, we're a collaborative of community-based organizations, artists, financial institutions, nonprofit developers, healthcare providers, and we're really looking at how do we leverage the areas around transit to really support people through the whole gamut of human needs, right? And so in 2012, Chicago passed its first transit-oriented development policy. It was very race neutral. What it meant is that we saw a lot of very dense development, either in already wealthy high-income areas or in low-income Hispanic areas, and then that triggered a lot of gentrification. Meanwhile, we continue to see tons of vacant land in Black communities around transit. So we went back to the drawing board in 2019. We passed an ordinance that required the city of Chicago to come up with a plan for how do we advance racial equity through transit-oriented development. So our mission is really that E part of ETOD, right? Equitable transit-oriented development. And so in the new iteration of our TOD policy, now our ETOD policy, we did reduce the one-to-one requirement around parking near the train stations in the half-mile radius, but also in the most frequently used bus corridors as well. So we are starting to expand TOD policies to include bus routes. And our hope is that as we develop ETOD, we're also emphasizing cultural resilience and representation in our spaces. So in Logan Square, there's a massive $20 million investment that is coming to our neighborhood to create a new pedestrian plaza to make our neighborhood more walkable. Of course, it's coming now because, you know, it's gentrified, right? And the wealthier people are demanding that. Well, when the city revealed its first renderings of this new plaza, they didn't even have people of color in the rendering. They didn't even have families or children in the rendering. And we're like, what the heck? Do we just like not exist to these people? We don't. So that's why we organize, right? To make our needs, right, emerge to the forefront. But we organize as we do. And now I'm so excited because this year we're going to start construction on what is going to be known as La Placita. So our pedestrian plaza is now designed with the immigrant community in mind, right? And we're embarking on this project of developing 10 murals in 10 neighborhood schools that are predominantly Hispanic near La Placita. And then we're gonna install those same murals in our Placita so that when the children go to the heart of our community, they're gonna say, oh wow, I know that mural, I helped design it. I see it every day in my school. And it's not gonna be lost that this amenity is for our people too, which is often the case, right? That we're excluded from these spaces. So I'm very proud of Elevated Chicago. We're evolving. We were attached to a national effort called the Sustainable and Prosperous Communities Challenge. But now we kind of went rogue. We wanted to continue the work even as that project sunsetted. So honestly, if you want to look at what is possible to advance racial equity near transit, look at Logan Square, look at Chicago. We're not a silver bullet. We don't have all the answers, but I feel really confident that Logan Square will not go in the trajectory of other neighborhoods that have been gentrified in Chicago. We will never be a 90% white community because we've won so much affordable housing for working class people and people of color right in the center of our community, and I'm so proud of that.
You should be. You should be. All right, we're as expected, we're starting to run short of time, but I do want to ask, before I get to the audience questions, one more kind of rapid fire question for each one of y'all. So, with your work or lived experience with ETOD, what are some mistakes that you have seen made or opportunities that are missed? You know, failure is the best teacher, you know, or mistakes are the best teachers. So what is something you've seen that just didn't work that we should really be mindful of as we go down this path in Austin? So you want to start with this, Chessy?
Sure, and I've mentioned it already, but placing affordable, right at the beginning, having affordable housing at the transit. I think our Denver missed a lot of opportunities at Denver Union Station, which is our kind of signature TOD project, and it's thousands of units and thousands of square feet of commercial space and one little affordable housing project that managed to get in at the end. And it's such an economic center for the city now, and it was a rail yard, so it didn't displace anybody, but there was such an opportunity to incorporate a more diverse, economically, racially, socially community there, and it was completely lost. And there's reasons for that. It was a very risky project at the time, and it doesn't always happen the way you want it to. But I think incorporating affordable housing, requiring affordable housing in whatever regulatory ways you can, right from the beginning at transit, will safeguard that space for as long as it can. And I mean, the other market rate projects that we've seen, as I mentioned, going in at stations are, again, a lost opportunity where the developer was able to capitalize on the new system or suddenly available land and build housing for non-riders, which is a pity, really. And I think the more land that you can acquire, the better, and then the more regulation that you can, whatever it is legally that you can do here to ensure that those units are affordable, like having low parking ratios, for example, to encourage organically affordable development around transit stations, the better.
My answer to this is actually somewhat inspired by two of the answers from Christian and Karen earlier, which is that I think that one of the mistakes that I saw in a lot of this ETOD sort of like value-focused policy that we had been pushing in California for a period of time is that equitable TOD is not exclusively price-restricted, low-income, affordable housing. It's also making sure that the development occurring broadly around a station is equitable. And two tools that we have seen to be extraordinarily effective in this that were not necessarily at the forefront and we've sort of had to claw back from is what blunt policy tools can you use to make development incentives really powerful or dampen an incentive in alignment with these goals. So for example, in some of the development sort of incentive and streamlining policies around transit that we've worked on in California, out of the gate, no parcel where you'd be allowed, where you would need to demolish rental housing is eligible, period. Just categorically, if you're gonna have to demolish existing rental housing in order to build that development, you don't get that incentive. Similarly, to a point that Christian made earlier, if a parcel has, for example, an eviction history looking back 5 to 10 years, can't use that development incentive on that parcel. And so that's getting ahead of this longer time arc of the speculation that we see around many of these stations. And some argue, well, that's really, really too blunt a tool. There are always some edge cases where maybe it's okay. And that's probably true. But we have to ask ourselves, what is our risk tolerance about those false positives, false negatives? And I think that two of these blunt policy tools, again, that I've seen be really powerful that we did not necessarily understand at the beginning, we did not include from the beginning, and we're now having to patch together a lot of policies that were passed years ago and including this, is things like the stuff that Karen had listed on her chart, like how do we just make it so you can't demolish rental housing? How do we make it so that you can't create this pressure around making it financially attractive for someone to evict someone? We can use policy to get ahead of that if we do so in a smart way.
Hopefully some of the council aides out there are taking notes like
Give me a call.
Yeah, so three things I think we learned. The first thing is the game is in ownership of the land. And so if you have publicly owned land, leverage that. If you can buy land, get in there and acquire it. And that was just a huge mistake all over the Bay Area. And 50 years after BART was built, you still have vacant sites nearby the transit station. It's a waste. Number two, actually, Annie just covered this really, but when thinking about all of the housing policies we should do, think about the order, be strategic about the order. So you want to preserve housing, affordable housing units. You want to protect tenants, and then build. You can build. Mm-hmm. It's great, build. But first, keep the community in place.
first, do no harm.
Yes, yep. right. First, do no harm. And then third, this kind of goes back to what Dr. Perry was saying in the morning. He was talking about data, and data's not everything. And I think that's totally right. And if you show data to people, they're just going to double down. You say 55%, voted for blah blah blah, and they'll say, well, 45% didn't, right? And then you don't get anywhere. So that means that it's important to ground these in processes where communities have dialogues, early on, and rather than the experts kind of coming in with the data and the numbers.
Yeah, I have a specific example where one of the train stations in our community, the Belmont Blue Line station, was renovated. This was a $57 million investment to renovate one train station. And it looks beautiful now, I'm not gonna lie. It looks like it looks like a really cool, big blue spaceship. It does not have an elevator, right? So designed for people, not for aesthetics, right? And take it a step further. What would it look like to design a joyful space, a space that was invited? inviting to families, to children, to opportunities for education, opportunities to connect to each other, opportunities for green infrastructure, to capture rainwater, to grow native plants, right? To restore the environment. There's so much potential. We just have to get creative, and we need to listen to communities, not just to check a box, as is often the case, right? But to actually give us some power, some say. And then the last thing is look at the policy around evictions and notices and make sure that people at least have a fair notice, a fair window of time to make their next move if they have to be displaced, right? Because in Chicago, up until a couple years ago, it was legal to give a 30 days eviction notice. And so we would see these large multifamily buildings near a train station get bought by a developer, and then 30-day notices slipped under every door in December, in Chicago, with the winter, in the middle of the school year, right? But today, we organize, we want a fair notice policy. So today, every Chicagoan has a right to 120 days notice, not just for an eviction, but even for a rent increase, right? Give people the time to plan for these transitions.
Wow. Wow. All right. Let's get to y'all's questions. So the first one is, historically, much of the opposition to building more affordable housing in the gentrified / richer parts of Austin has relied on arguments for environmental preservation. How can we address this opposition? Are y'all hearing this? Were y'all?
I'm understanding environmental preservation is basically like conservation, so like not building on wildlands or outward. Is that a fair understanding?
Or is it environmental impact?
I mean, I've heard both, right? In some areas, well, we have this beautiful green space nearby, and we don't want to develop there. Or I've heard, well, it's going to exacerbate, flooding. We have lots of environmental issues here in Austin, and sometimes sometimes they're very genuine and they're very reasonable. Sometimes they're weaponized. And I'm sure the context is different in every city. How do we get over that? But I think it's the same question for almost any kind of objection to building more housing in some of these areas.
I don't know if I know how we get over it, but we just had a very high-profile case of that in Denver, where there's a golf course that has a conservation easement, and it's privately owned, and it's years of work, ballot measures, et cetera. But the outcome is that, through ballot measure, the people of Denver voted against what I would call a very equitable and very progressive, very dense development on space that has been used, by, I don't know, a few dozen people for the past, years, and that will not be a park. And I think so that the sort of the weaponization of it is people saying, we need this green space, the city should buy it and make it a park, and you can't trust developers who are going to come in here. They say they're going to build affordable housing, but we don't trust them. I think they were going to build affordable housing, and the developer has sunk a lot of money into this. They're not going to sell it to the city, and the city doesn't have the resources to buy it. And so, is it NIMBYism? Is it racism? It's hard to say, and it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years, because it really was going to house a lot of people in an area that has not seen equitable development in the levels that it should have.
I'll also add, I think that it's important when looking at and responding to some of these concerns that do come up is really trying to get at the core as, is this pushback because of access to an amenity? Or is this pushback because of principled environmental concerns and environmental stewardship? Because those are also two very different things that are mitigated in different ways. And they often get conflated because rhetorically it's almost beneficial for those to be vague. If this is an amenity, maybe you're losing access to this one little part of the waterfront, but the project will include better access to a different part of the waterfront. Maybe it's the park is going to be redesigned in a different way to actually increase all of the things that you love about the park as a part of the project design. That is very different than there's flood risk, there's an endangered species here, there's all of these there's toxic waste on the site, and that's an environmental concern about developing on the site, those are things that are not about amenities. Those are about sort of how are we responsible stewards of our environment, and is it possible to design or engineer a project to mitigate these risks? Or is this fair's fair? This actually might be a bad site for that kind of development. And I think that it's important to really challenge and get to the heart of a lot of this pushback. Because there are ways that you can mitigate, for example, for flood risk. There are ways that in some cases you can mitigate for endangered species habitats. There are many cases where you cannot. And then we have to have the values conversation about where what we want out of our development does and does not fit into that. But sometimes environmental preservation is really about access to valuable amenities. And that is a far more solvable problem that we should just be able to look at in the eye and then offer as a direct response.
Well, we may have time for one more question. Let me jump to one more, unless y'all wanted to address anything on that one. Okay, let me just scroll through here. Many times in high opportunity areas, the only affordable housing allowed is workforce housing. What are strategies to build deeply affordable housing in high opportunity communities? Oof.
You've got to direct the subsidy there. You've got to be able to make up for the cost difference because land in those communities is more expensive. And you've got to reform the land use rules to allow deeply affordable housing to actually be built. In many cases, it's not just that projects, for example, aren't competitive for financing there because the costs are higher, right? That is something you have to also look at in the eye and solve through policy and through different funding regulations. But also, many of these communities have been able to hoard opportunity, stay wealthy, and stay exclusive because of land use laws. And so you also have to be able to say, okay, so what are the land use laws that need to change? What are the zoning laws that need to change? What are the pathways for political interference that exist that need to be closed because the politics of the existing community may not already be in favor of affordable housing? And then how do you unblock those? How do you address those? And how do you, again, make it so that the wraparound policy apparatus and funding apparatus is promoting and not excluding deeply affordable housing? And you really need the whole patchwork there.
Well, I think part of it also goes back to most likely public ownership, because a deeply affordable project is so expensive, and as we talked about, you have to piece together so many different things. It's going to take a while. Meanwhile, there's going to be development pressure on that land in those high opportunity areas. So having an owner that's patient, like a public entity, is probably pretty important while you put together the capital stack or change the land use laws to allow for or to catalyze that deeply affordable housing. So patience, a patient landowner.
And just one more point, which is that we're doing a lot of multiplex laws across the country, which is great. But Portland always does it one better than the rest of the world. And what Portland is doing with its multiplex law is saying, by the way, you can't build McMansions. Because what's happening much more in these high opportunity areas is that people are building bigger houses, they're building monster homes. They're doing renoductions, we call it. So they're reducing the amount of space, and they're taking away any kind of extra unit that was affordable. So make sure you ban that too, put that on the list.
Yeah, well, I'm sure somebody from TPPF is listening in on this session right now and is drafting legislation as we speak. Did you want to close on that question, Christian, or are you good?
Sure. Defund the police.
All right. On that non-controversial note, I'm getting the sign to wrap up, but this has been a great conversation. There are so many fantastic questions that you submitted that we did not get to. So I'm hopeful that maybe during our next break, if y'all are around, somebody can grab y'all and ask those questions. Again, Joe's Bakery. Thank you so much for being here with us today, for your contributions and your work in your own communities, and really sharing them with communities like Austin that really could benefit and profit from your experiences and expertise. And thanks to the folks at HousingWorks for putting this together. But with that, let's give them a round of applause.